You're listening to the Cricket Podcast.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Cricket Podcast, where today we're not going to be covering a cricket match. Instead, we're going to be talking about a topic that we're probably a little bit overdue on, to be honest. Earlier this week, on Tuesday, Azeem Rafiq spoke at a DCMS hearing in the UK Parliament on the topic of his experience of racism in English cricket. He was then followed by Roger Hutton, the ex-Yorkshire CEO, and a delegation from the ECB led by their CEO, Tom Harrison. I'm Jack Hope. To discuss this story, how we got here, what happened at the hearing, and where we're going to be going next, and how we might hopefully start solving some of the problems in the English game. I'm joined by Max Brown. How are you doing, Max?
Hello. Yeah, very good, thanks. And looking forward to getting into the nitty-gritty of this.
And someone who has covered the story excellently on his Twitter timeline, Nakul Pande. How are you doing, Nakul?
Yeah. As good as can be in the circumstances. I think, it's been a week.
It has certainly been a week. In terms of a bit of structure for this show, because we have quite a broad audience that is quite global. I think we're going to go through sort of four things. One, who Azeem Rafiq is, because it's important. I think that we do talk about him. These are things that happen to real people, and keeping a focus on that fact is important in all of us understanding the problems. And we're going to talk about the timeline of the story today. It's what happened at the DCMS hearings. And then, as I said, where we might go next. So, Max, Azeem Rafiq, who is he?
Obviously, there's Azeem Rafiq, the cricketer. So, as he, in his early years, he was a highly rated off-spinning all-rounder in growing up in Barnsley in England. He captained the under-15 side in 2006. He scored a century in his second first-class match in 2009. Went on to captain the England under-19s in tests in one days in the under-19 World Cup in 2010, and so ultimately, in his early years, was regarded as a natural leader by Yorkshire, which it seems they're now finding out the hard way is definitely the case. But I mean, he also became Yorkshire's youngest captain in 2012. He was their first captain of Asian origin, and did a pretty good job at it as well, by all accounts. And at this stage, from the outside, it looks like you've got a situation where you've just got a good up and coming rising star. Obviously, we now know that there was a lot more going on behind the scenes about that. But as you said, Jack, this is not just about Azeem Rafiq, the cricketer. It's about him as a person and what he's gone through and his experiences. As someone who was born in Karachi in Pakistan and moved over to England when he was 10. He was practicing Muslim and that. There's that side to it. So we really have to consider as well that at this point, it's not just about, should Tom Harrison be the chairman of the ECB? Should all the Yorkshire board resign? This is about, actual human stories and experiences that people have gone through.
True, absolutely. So apologies, I had to just walk off my internet box. It wouldn't be a cricket podcast if the internet didn't break down at some point. So I had to move that around. Absolutely, yeah, it is important. Nakul, On your timeline earlier this week, you were tweeting along with the hearings. But if we can rewind and go back to the sort of beginning, what's the genesis of this story? Who does Azeem Rafiq speak to? When does he speak to them? And how does this ball start rolling?
The first time that Azeem Rafiq made any formal claims, initially not of racism but of bullying. So not with a specific racial component, was in 2017, when during his second spell at the club, because he had been at the club for a long time, had left, his contract had not been renewed despite some excellent performances. He came back after a brief spell at Derbyshire and after doing very, very well in Yorkshire League cricket, and he raised bullying allegations against senior members of the playing and coaching staff. This then escalates to him raising cases of racist bullying and harassment, and his his treatment during that process was to be dismissed and to be briefed against and to be excluded and further bullied. And picking up on Max's point about Azeem Rafiq, the person, rather than the cricketer, during this time, he and his wife were going through a very difficult pregnancy. And partway through this process, their son was stillborn. So they lost the baby while Azeem Rafiq was bringing this disciplinary process against Yorkshire. He went to senior members of the Yorkshire board, not just those he was dealing with directly. Most notably Hanif Malik, whose name has come up a few times in the context of this hearing, who was a member of the Yorkshire board, who was also a member of the National Asian Cricket Council, which is the official advisory body on matters of South Asian cricket to the ECB. And he spoke very movingly, both in his testimony to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. In case you're wondering what DCMS means, every department in the UK, every government department in the UK has what's called a select committee to oversee activities relating to the brief of that committee, and this is the group of members of Parliament that Azeem spoke in front of on Tuesday. But not just in that hearing, but also in his written testimony, which we've just had released a couple of days ago to an employment tribunal, which he began against Yorkshire and which settled just a few days ago. Hanif Malik did not take his concerns seriously, despite saying he would, despite saying that he would raise it with Andrew Gale, the then coach and former captain, whose name crops up a number of times in the context of this matter, and to senior officials. To sort of set the scene, Mark Arthur, the CEO, Martin Moxon, the long-serving director of cricket, former player, and various chairs, including Steve Dennison, who was the former chair, and most recently Roger Hutton, who was chair in 2020. Robin Smith, who was not the former England player, but the former chair of Yorkshire, who was chair in the 2014 in around 2014-2016. Hanif Malik heard his concerns and, rather than taking them seriously, in effect reported him to the club. He got very little support from bodies outside cricket. He got very little support from the Professional Cricketers Association, which is effectively the trade union, the representative body for cricketers in this country. Not a concept that exists in some other countries. So if you are listening from for example, the subcontinent, where players boards and players unions aren't a thing, there is one in the UK, and it's supposed to support members, both current and former professional cricketers. One of the details that emerged one of the details that Azeem brought to light was the fact that his personal development manager was a former Yorkshire player and was employed by Yorkshire at the time, and did not take his concerns seriously, and indeed was in effect reporting on him to the club. And he spoke to a lawyer associated with the Professional Cricketers Association and was told that he didn't have a case. He then, only through launching something roughly equivalent to a Freedom of Information Act request, but what's called a subject data access request, so requesting to see your own data from your own investigation when you launch one, that helping him would have taken the PCA's entire budget for the entire legal budget for the year. He was not told this at the time. He was fobbed off and made to feel as though he didn't have a case. The bullying got worse and worse over this time as he felt singled out. An example of this would be a number of players raised concerns about the behaviour of senior players such as Tim Brasnan and Steve Patterson. Azeem felt that he, as someone who had raised disciplinary concerns in the past and as a person of colour, the other players faced no negative actions for speaking out. He did. There are a number of flashpoint and really horrendous instances that were brought to light. I keep saying were brought to light, that Azeem brought to light, both before the hearing and in his witness testimony to the employment tribunal, including the former chair Steve Dennison coming up to him at a function and asking glibly about his child, even though said child had died before he was born. The director of cricket being very verbally aggressive to him and tearing strips off him the day after he came back from his bereavement leave after burying his child, which sounds melodramatic, but that's what happened. And Azeem felt that he had no option but to leave the club. He was not renewed again, despite performing very well in T20 cricket. And then he took his fight for justice to legal avenues, engaged solicitors. This eventually eventually managed to find some support in the press from Taha Hashim at Wisden, James Butler, who runs the Cricket Badger podcast and was a former Yorkshire press officer, who, when he spoke to Azeem Rafiq, took on his case, and most notably George de Bell, now of the Cricketer, then of Cricinfo. George and James championed his cause, eventually leading to Yorkshire launching the investigation that what I suppose we must call the ill-fated investigation. So that's it up until the point that Yorkshire start to investigate.
And then the Yorkshire investigation. Immediately there are questions raised around that, because and there are so many instances of this of structural failure in this story. You've already sort of touched upon the union issue there, whereby an ex-representative of the county was the union rep, I suppose.
Current representative Matthew Wood was working for Yorkshire at the time. He was employed by them at the time.
Yeah. Well, there's a huge conflict of interest there to begin with. But even with the investigation, I'm right in saying here, aren't I, that the investigation, the legal firm employed to carry out the investigation, have close links with ex-chair Roger Hutton.
He used to be a partner at the firm, yes. Yorkshire were allowed to appoint their own legal firm were able to choose the legal firm who investigated. That law firm then appointed a panel, which included Hanif Malik, incidentally. It's not incidental at all. It's very germane to the matter. Included Hanif Malik, who had previously dismissed Azeem's concerns. It included Gulfraz Riaz, the head of the National Asian Cricket Council, who was then asked to step down from the panel after it emerged that he had also dismissed or not taken seriously Azeem's concerns. Headed up by a surgeon, Dr. Samir Partak, who is an East Yorkshire-based surgeon of Indian origin, who has said nothing publicly or privately since about the way the report that bears his and the names of others has been handled. And this investigation was carried out, was meant to take 3 months, was meant to be handed over to Yorkshire and to the ECB. None of those things happened, certainly not within 3 months. The panel did not speak to a number of key witnesses. The panel, by Azeem's testimony, became hostile and defensive towards him when the severity of what Azeem was talking about emerged over the course of him speaking to the panel, to the investigatory panel, and to the legal firm Squire Patton Boggs. And it became very apparent that the investigatory panel and the law firm were trying to bury this report before it even came to light. And only really through sustained press pressure from James and from Wisden and from a few others, and from particularly George de Bell, forced the eventual emergence of an executive summary of this report, and through some and to the eventual leaking of part of the panel's recommendations, which even at that stage, even after all of these fudges, they came to a very different conclusion to the lawyers. Even the law firm Squire Patton Boggs for example, and this is really where some of this got started in terms of pushing it to national attention. The instances of use of the P word, P star Ki. I can't really. I don't really want to say it out loud. Azeem did, yes, before the DCMS hearing, and I think it was a very powerful use of that word. I feel very uncomfortable using it, but the use of that word, the law firm described that as racist. The investigatory panel making recommendations off that report described it as banter. Once that leaked, then parliamentary figures started getting involved, and then we got to not an inquiry. It should be stated it's not an inquiry, but it didn't have legal powers to compel anyone to appear, which is why, for example, Mark Arthur, the recently resigned CEO of Yorkshire, and Martin Moxon, the director of cricket, who is currently on what is being described as stress-related personal leave from Yorkshire, were not compelled to appear and were able to ignore the invitations to appear. That panel got going. There's more to say about the travesty that it's ended up with this Parliament investigating. I might come on to that a little bit later, because I think it is towards the end. But that's where we got to the stage where Azeem Rafiq had his day in Parliament. And what is important to note about that is that Yorkshire hid behind the claims that they could not release the full report because it would open them up to libel and defamation suits from players who were named in the report, players and former officials, and other people who were named in the report. That does not apply to reporting of parliamentary committees. So anything that Azeem Rafiq said and was then reported, as long as it was reported accurately, people could be named publicly, which is why it was important that it got to this stage, and why what happened on Tuesday was so important, because it meant that Azeem Rafiq could show the receipts.
Yeah, have his day and actually, tell his truth, tell his story. Max, we were talking just before Nakul joined us in the proverbial green room about the journey of this report a little bit. I think it's sort of worth talking about the extent to which Yorkshire County Cricket Club tried to obfuscate and delay with this report, particularly pertaining, we'll talk about the contents in a second, but when they released the executive summary, for example.
Yes, on the day of India pulling out of the fifth test against England, when you mentioned Nakul sort of in the sort of, I guess we're going to maybe bring it back to this Parliament before maybe you were planning to, but sort of there's a general tactic in government of pushing through bills that you don't want people to see on the very last day before recess, and sort of burying the bad news. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Yorkshire tried to pull with releasing the summary on the day of that test, which fortunately didn't really wash with everyone.
No, they sort of forgot to work. They forgot to mention that actually you had a bunch of journalists with nothing to do who suddenly thought, ooh.
Yeah, well, it's the whole process. That report has been one of the most botched attempted cover-ups I think I can sort of remember. You've got that, you've got the bit where saying, there was it the seven claims out of the 43 were upheld, and then to say that it wasn't racist, and then it was racist, but no one's being. We're not going to discipline anyone from it, despite the fact that obviously people in the report were named who are currently at Yorkshire. So
or to draw an equivalence between the terms Zimbo,
yes,
which is roughly equivalent to calling someone from New Zealand a Kiwi, I've heard, or someone from Australia an Aussie, and the P word. It's sort of beyond belief.
Which, by the way, even the law firm themselves didn't do that. The investigating lawyers who actually interviewed Azeem Rafiq and I think Gary Ballance didn't do that. That was the panel. That was the supposedly independent panel who were meant to be making recommendations to Yorkshire. who drew that equivalence.
Yeah. Now, if you can't see the structural failing there, then
then perhaps you're
I mean, of
deliberately
course you
trying
can.
to avoid the structural failure.
Of course, you can see the structural
Yes.
failing there. Yeah, it's well, yeah. I mean, like I say, beyond belief. Should we move on to the DCMS hearings? I think we've told the story of how we got to this point reasonably well. Azeem Rafiq's testimony, and I believe this is all up on YouTube if you want to go back and listen to it. And if you're a fan of English cricket, if you're a fan of cricket in general, you probably should do this. It's revealing, it's captivating. Azeem Rafiq tells the story in a very eloquent, lengthy way, and it's really very effective at communicating the I
would
encourage
anyone to go and watch it.
Yeah, it's
because
all up
it's
all up on the BBC, on the Parliament. If you go to parliamentlive.tv, it's all there, and search for that, or type DCMS Select Committee in, and it's all there. And various clips have gone around, but the full thing is well worth watching. I was watching it live, and live tweeting it at the time, and nobody should have to be that strong, nobody should have to be that eloquent to be taken seriously, but it was very clear that Azeem has been waiting for this for a very long time. And was really very ready for the opportunity to speak in a completely matter-of-fact and frank way about what he had experienced over his time at Yorkshire and before. Because there are two incidents that happened. One that he mentioned in front of the committee, and one that he mentions in his witness testimony. Both happened when he was 15 years old. One, the one you might not have heard about if you haven't read the witness testimony, when he and a number of other South Asian players were part of Yorkshire's under-15 teams, there was no halal food offered. The players could not in effect, not eat during their time representing Yorkshire's under-15s. They made representations, nothing was done about it. The one you will have heard is the story of Azeem Rafiq as a player at Barnsley Cricket Club in West Yorkshire, being held down by senior players in a car. Not sure whether the car was moving at the time, just in case but nevertheless, in a car, and had red wine poured down his throat as a 15-year-old. Now, regardless of what religion you are, being held down as a child and being forced to drink alcohol is abusive.
Bad enough, yeah.
Is abusive.
I think the various abuses stack up on top of each other there, don't they? I mean, if you're forced to drink alcohol at any point, that's an abuse. If you're
grown men holding down a child, if you are forcing somebody to drink when it is against their religion to do so, if you're forcing a child to drink, even if you're encouraging / peer pressuring a child to drink, or someone who doesn't want to drink, that is deeply coercive and using your position of power. It is appalling, and it is remarkable that he wanted to keep playing cricket after that. But as Azeem Rafiq said a number of times, and a lot of people listening will empathize with this, you don't want to believe it. You don't want to believe that you're being treated differently because of an essential characteristic of who you are. You don't want to believe that you can't overcome it, that you can't make it. Osman Samiuddin talked about this very well in his Cricinfo piece, and it allies to something that I think I've talked about on this show before. Sports people are unusually self-confident and unusually driven. You believe that you can overcome anything. You believe that you can overcome all of this and by your talent push yourself through despite all of the disadvantages that are stacked against you. And for a time, Azeem Rafiq did. As we talked about his career, and we talked about what a good player he was, and we talked about the fact that he could even, despite all of this, played for England at some point at senior level, potentially. Certainly he was good enough to do so. But that's where it starts, even before he becomes a Yorkshire player. When he becomes a Yorkshire player, the club don't register him properly and for a T20 match, and it emerges then that he is not eligible to play for them, despite him repeatedly telling them what his status was as someone who moved to Pakistan.
The Home Office had sat on his application.
Who had moved from Pakistan 6 years ago, I think, or 6 or 7 years ago by this point. 6 years ago, I think he was 16. The club then put it out that Azeem had not told them that he had moved from, that he was not born in the UK and had moved as a child, which is just a lie. They either someone had lost the paperwork, or they're lying, or both. And this is in one of his very, very first games for the club, and he's made out to be the bad guy for as though trying to hide his status, which gets into a whole nother horrible set of what is proper British, which is nasty and horrific enough on top of everything else. So it starts from his very, very earliest times as a developing cricketer at regional and county level.
Yeah. And it continues. I think it's worth spending a bit of time talking about his testimony, because there are some really horrific things that happened to him and other players from big names in the English game. I'm not going to read out all of the slurs, but Matthew Horgod was one. I think called him an elephant washer at one point, along with a couple of other incidents. He was made to sit in certain parts of the dressing room along with the other Asian heritage players. Michael Vaughan, we know this now bluntly. He told Azeem Rafiq and other players that there's too many of you lot and we need to do something about it. He hasn't had support from other big names in the English game. Joe Root was spoken about in the DCMS hearing, and I think this sort of illustrates the way that a lot of this sort of became normalized. That it actually wasn't memorable because it was so normal.
It points to the culture issue, doesn't it?
Yeah, we've talked about the use of the P word consistently in his used towards him and other players. I mean, there's I'm not going to read the slur, but he was called Rafa the something by Matthew Horgod and didn't realise until later that it was actually a racial slur. That was also by Gary Balance, and
kafir, the word that is in a Southern African context an incredibly loaded racist slur. Azeem Rafiq thought at the time that it was just something that, because it rhymed, it is a word that, if you're not aware of that as a white person from Southern Africa, if you claim to be that, then that really does stretch credibility. Matthew Horgod has since personally apologised to Azeem Rafiq, which Azeem has spoken both publicly and I understand privately as being very appreciative of. And by all accounts, apologised in a way that actually took responsibility for what he said, not just for the effect of what it said, which is, rule number one of public apology, or apology of any kind. Actually mean it and actually take responsibility for your actions. He's spoken about his sister Umna Rafiq, who was on the board at Leicestershire and doing some work, and the backlash against Wasim Khan, who was chair at Leicestershire at the time, to point out that it wasn't just an issue at Yorkshire. He's spoken about having been told subsequently of players at a number of different counties. I think Nottinghamshire were mentioned, Leicestershire were mentioned, a few other counties as well.
Essex Maurice Chambers this week.
Essex have 2 investigations ongoing. Somerset have just investigated Jack Brooks and released a sort of halfway good sort of statement today. Alex Hales is being investigated by Nottinghamshire. One that isn't actually being investigated, Sumit Patel, current Nottinghamshire player, tweeted that he to the effect that players were jumping on a bandwagon when they were bringing forward claims of racist treatment. As far as I'm aware,
interesting way of putting a movement of anti-racism, isn't it?
Yeah, and as far as I'm aware, that's got no attention beyond some angry people on Twitter. As far as I'm aware, Gary Balance's non-apology, the the 13 or 14 members of current Yorkshire staff who signed a letter asking why the club didn't come down harder, basically, on Azeem Rafiq and try and publicly smear him and launch a stronger denial from the outset, and made use of the term white rose values and that Azeem Rafiq didn't share them, essentially retroactively calling for a character assassination in public, as has happened anyway, but to Azeem Rafiq. He didn't get any support from the local press either. Chris Waters, the chief cricket writer at the Yorkshire Post, has been consistently taking the club's side on this matter during the reporting of the investigation, very much defending the integrity of the club. And I would also urge you to not just read not just watch his testimony, but read the statement that he gave to the Employment Tribunal, where he details page after page after page after page of racist words and actions and bullying treatment that was meted out to him and other players of South Asian descent during his time at the club.
There's got to be a general bemusement, hasn't there, that the people are still coming out and trying to defend this and trying to paint Azeem Rafiq as the perpetrator and not the victim in this sort of clearly very one-sided situation. I think it's somewhat astounding that people are still doing the mental gymnastics to try and believe that they're not in the wrong. And I think you mentioned as well, Matthew Hoggard is pretty much, from what I've seen, the only person who's actually genuinely apologised for anything.
The other person who has done that is David Lloyd. David Lloyd did. David Lloyd, who sent some messages to James Butler, actually, the host of the Cricket Badger podcast, talking about the culture of South Asian players, again, not drinking, not being part of the bar, and accusing South Asian players en masse of not paying their subs. He then briefly got angry about the fact that those became public, I believe through George Tabell. I'm not entirely sure of that, but certainly became public. But he has since apologised directly. He called Azeem Rafiq directly and spoke. And his apology had the right words in it and had the right tone to it. But we've had Michael Vaughan, Tim Bresnan, Alex Hales, Jack Brooks. There are others I'm missing as well who have given Mark Arthur non-apologies. At various stages.
What do you think's worse? Is it worse to just say I didn't do it, or is it worse to apologise but say, but actually, I'm not really apologising? Like Gary went, so I'm sorry, but also you said some bad stuff too.
That was astonishing that anyone thought that was a good idea. Frankly, there's a lot of file under who wrote this or who signed off on this. I found it particularly galling. I am sorry if you were hurt, but I didn't do anything, and if I did, it wasn't racist anyway. Tone of some recent apologies, and you'd say it's mind-boggling. It's not really.
Well, I suppose in the context that all of this has gone on in the first place, yeah. But
it shouldn't be shocking. Yes, be shocked and be appalled and be hurt and be angry, but don't be surprised if people actually quite like saying whatever the hell they like and not having any consequences for it.
Yeah, I think it's going to take a lot more, isn't it, to get to a point where we are right to be surprised about that sort of thing, which is a horrible fact to face. But
or to take a much dimmer and more serious view, actually, think about these things on more than a superficial level. And I think in some cases that probably shouldn't be discounted. Just to wrap up on Azeem Rafiq's testimony, I thought possibly the most harrowing part of or the most disturbing part of the testimony was when he talked about the time he was reported missing by the PCA and speculated, I think, that the only reason they'd done that was so that they would cover their backs in the event that he committed suicide. Having at that point, been driven to that desperate a situation, which is, I think that
Just imagine what that must feel like for a second. You're sitting with your family and you get a call that you have been reported missing, and you believe that it's not out of concern for you, but that somebody is covering their ass in case you take your life. And Azeem Rafiq had a lot of rounds of psychological and psychiatric help at this point, and has, I know from speaking to people who have been close to him, and I've had a little bit of conversation with him himself, that there have been some incredibly dark times over this past 18 months and before. Any one of these, or any handful of these incidents, would be enough to severely affect one's mental health and one's emotional health. Quite apart from, the impact of losing a stillborn child, and then not being supported by the club, and being accused of making too much of that, although it's possible to make too much of burying your unborn child.
Yeah,
it is astonishing. The truly surprising and astonishing thing is that Azeem Rafiq has had the strength, and has had the patience, and has had the appetite to keep pursuing this process as long as he has, and to keep going beyond his day in front of the DCMS committee. Nobody should have to be that strong.
Yes, and it has, been quite an astonishing amount of strength that he's shown to get things where they are, and it's been driven by him to such a significant extent, really. If we can move on, so to two other people or groups testified at the DCMS hearing. Roger Hutton, the ex-chair of Yorkshire, who we might gloss over slightly in the interest of time, because we do want to talk about sort of what happened next. But an ECB delegation was also there, headed by Tom Harrison, the current CEO, who now looks like he'll be in trouble. There's been a bit of a county uprising against Tom Harrison, so it might be that he is deposed in the near future. What really struck me about the ECB testimony, and again, if we talk about structures here rather than people, it's not, the problem here isn't that Michael Vaughan may or may not hold racist views, or that Gary Balance calls people of colour Kevin. Obviously that is a problem, but the wider problem here is that there are structures that permit this, enable it, and to some extent, let's be honest here, encourage this kind of behaviour. And
that structures that are supposedly in place to prevent and punish it were not followed.
Exactly. A great example of this from the ECB's, paraphrasing slightly, but I'm genuinely serious here, ever so slightly. The ECB appoint their own regulatory committee to assess whether the ECB is fit to govern the English game. Now, if you cannot see the conflict of interest in that situation, then, again, of course you can see the conflict of interest there.
This is nothing, by the way, that cricket isn't used to on a global level. Just yesterday, Sourav Ganguly was appointed head of the World Cricket Committee while also being chair of the BCCI and a member of the ICC board. And this kind of thing happens all the time in cricket, and it happens in government as well, incidentally. The government is forever appointing its own independent commissions and regulators.
Just tried to change the rules so that they could mark their own homework on whether or not they're breaking the rules, which is essentially what we've got going on here, isn't it?
Yeah, again, this is not surprising, but the ECB's head of legal, Mina Botros, saying it in such stark terms on camera, obviously has got a lot of people talking, and a lot of people are going to take this in their own directions in terms of the perennial, what does the ECB, structure of English government, English cricket governance and so forth, and using it to tear down the ECB and start again, or the county boards now feeling embarrassed essentially by having Tom Harrison represent them, want him gone, as they did with the former chair Ian Watmore after partly his conduct around the cancellation of the tour of Pakistan, which is also a significant factor in the increasingly untenable position of Tom Harrison, but also his performance at a board meeting. And I believe from what we know of the situation, that the primary spur of the move now to oust Tom Harrison is because the county chairs and the county boards feel embarrassed, not because of any particular concern for Azeem Rafiq, not because of anything beyond a general concern to be doing the right thing or seem to be doing the right thing, but because they feel embarrassed and because the English game has been laid wide open for everyone to see.
Yeah, to really skim over some of the ECB stuff, because we are a little bit pressed for time. Unfortunately, Max and I have to go back to work. But the DCMS hearing exposed some quite blatant mistakes, I think, the ECB made, and some areas where they should have been, as the game's governing board in the UK, governing, and they willfully chose not to govern.
To bring it back to the Azeem Rafiq matter, a theme that emerged through the testimony of Roger Hutton, through the testimony of Tom Harrison, and the other ECB board members, Kate Miller, the Chief Diversity and Communications Officer. Another question whether those two should be the same job. Mina Botched, Director of Legal and Integrity, and Alan Dickinson, who's a non-exec director, and to a lesser extent, Lord Patel, Kamlesh Patel, who was a former independent director at the ECB and is now the chair at Yorkshire, and seems to be really wanting to do stuff. What emerged is that we do not have any clarity about what the ECB were asked to do in terms of intervention, when they were asked to do it, and what they did about it. The ECB are going to hand over all of their documentation and all of their correspondence from that time between them and Yorkshire about whether they were asked to intervene in the investigation or start their own investigation. The ECB didn't know what the situation was. The ECB appeared not to be particularly interested in finding out what the situation was until forced to. And the ECB, Tom Harrison was essentially forced into categorically promising to do a couple of things. One, to use the power that the ECB have over funding and over major match hosting rights to hold leverage over counties who are found to have acted or not acted in a racist or discriminatory manner, as they have done with Yorkshire. And two, to stop letting counties investigate themselves as the first point without ECB intervention. The general tone of the first few months of the investigation was that the ECB knew it was going to be a fudge and were waiting for Yorkshire to fail. Now, if that had happened within 3 or 4 months, maybe. But once that's gone on for a year and a half,
do something.
Yeah, do something, anything.
We're going to wrap up really quickly with, I guess, more of a speculative question here about what we might see next in the English game. I know the ECB have opened up a survey calling for evidence from people involved in the wider game. I think there's over 1,000 reports
There were 1,000 reports to the Independent Commission for Equity on Cricket, which has some very good people on it, by the way. Worth looking at the people who are on that board, and they all seem fairly credible. Azeem said as much. So this is an anonymous survey, and there are a number of counties have anonymous hotlines or email addresses. Middlesex, rather stupidly, asked people to go directly to the chief exec, which I don't think is going to fill many people with confidence, given what has happened. I don't know much about the chief exec of Middlesex, but given what has happened out of the counties, that seems an unwise move.
They'll probably just set us out of office for a month.
They had 1,000 responses before Azeem Rafiq spoke to the commission. There's going to be a lot of this. There may be some kind of my speculation in terms of what's going to happen next. My somewhat informed speculation is that we will have a lot more players and former players and coaches and former junior players coming forward and speaking. Some of them publicly, some of them anonymously. We will have fans coming forward and speaking, probably anonymously. We will have members of staff at clubs speaking, probably anonymously. We will see resignations at various levels of various county boards, county leagues, county clubs, at the ECB. We will see a lot of people, a lot of heads rolling. We will probably see a number of people of colour appointed for good and ill reasons. we may well see some sort of Truth and Reconciliation Committee of the type that's going on in South Africa at the moment, the social justice and nation building hearings that are going on and have exposed a lot of stuff in South African cricket that I think a lot of people thought they'd have to go take with them to the grave. I cannot honestly say that we will see any structural change. I have no idea what that looks like at this stage. The scale of change that needs to happen at so many different levels all at the same time very quickly is staggering. I hope that we can start to make steps, and I hope that more people will believe people when they come forward the first time. And that future whistleblowers and future people who come forward don't have to wait 18 months. And to go back to a point we mentioned earlier, rely on a Tory government that is currently trying to push through Parliament a law to retroactively strip people of their citizenship without even telling them, let alone having a right to appeal. And by the way, none of the Tory MPs on the DCMS committee yesterday voted against it or against any of the government's measures to restrict immigration and restrict the rights of asylum. And two of the Labour MPs voted for the Blair government's pushes to restrict people to strip people of their citizenship in a much easier and much less legally watertight way back in the early 2000s. The scale of the ECB's failure and the biggest symptom of it is that Azeem Rafiq had to go to these people for a hearing.
Yeah, it's a disturbing situation, and as you sort of touched upon there, it's endemic of a lot of wider problems that we face in the UK. Nakul, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to have to wrap up the show reasonably quickly now so that Max and I can disappear off. Can you let people know where they can find you really, really briefly?
Yeah, I'm at Nakul Pande on Twitter. My pinned tweet is my live tweet of the DCMS proceedings at the moment. But yeah, go to the type DCMS committee into your search engine of choice, and go and read the testimony and watch it back. I would urge you to do that.
We're the Cricket Podcast, at the Cricket Pod on Twitter and Instagram. Our sponsor, which we didn't mention at the top of the show, is Woodstock Cricket. Thank you very much for listening to this. We'll continue to keep track of this story, I think, and do a bit better with our coverage, which was overwhelmed slightly by the volume of cricket recently. So thank you very much for listening and watching. Goodbye, Max. Goodbye, Nakul.
Goodbye. Thank you, Nakul, for joining us.
You're listening to the Cricket Podcast.